is oxytocin nature's medicine? The answer is yes. So it not only does it regulate the vagus, which regulates everything, it regulates mitochondria, which give you energy. Actually, most of the molecules in the body, you can get rid of them, or they are naturally not occurring. That's not true for oxytocin. It's rare that it's really low, except in people who have PTSD, and now we're just seeing other disorders that have abnormal or atypical sociality. Its real talent is to allow our bodies to adaptively respond to stress. It's, in many cases, probably the most important chemical in the body of mammals.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Hello and welcome. I'm here in Potsdam for the Polyvagal Conference 2024, and I have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Sue Carter. Welcome, Sue.
Thank you, Florence.
Thank you for agreeing to do this small talk together about your work, what you've been doing all those past years, and maybe do a link with the polyvagal theory. So what is it, the work you're doing around maybe love and those hormones?
Yes. Well, it probably makes more sense to go back 50 years and say that I set out to study the endocrinology of reproductive behaviors. And in those days, we thought steroid hormones like estrogen or androgens were the answer. Then about 1980, our first son, Eric, was born. And I went through what many women who've had children experience, which is a peculiar transformation. Nothing I was prepared for. I was busy. I didn't, even if it hadn't been, I wouldn't have known where to find information. So we managed, Eric and I, the birth. Steve was there. He was quite freaked out.
So Steve is Dr. Steve Porges.
Steve Porges, who is the father of Eric Porges. So at that time, I had requested no interventions. I wanted no hormones, no drugs, nothing done, because I am a biologist. I have this sort of, I take it in a sense as an act of faith that biology had managed this task of allowing women to have babies forever, for as long as there were mammals. Well, the birth was interesting. I won't go into that, but I did manage to avoid most of the interventions, except for the fact that they gave me this hormone called oxytocin. The medical name is Pitocin or Syntocin or Syntocinon. And it was supposed to speed up the labor, and whether it did or not, who knows. But it was extremely traumatizing, but not so much the hormone itself, but because I wanted to know what had happened to my baby as a result of me being given a compound. Fast forward 44 years, almost exactly, and I'm still studying oxytocin. I became, to some extent, bonded to that molecule, obsessed by it. Almost nothing was known when I started, except for a little bit of information on what it did to the uterus during birth and to mammary glands during lactation. So then I just began this kind of, very slowly at first, crusade to find out what was going on. And since the research at that point had not been done, I couldn't just go to the library and find the answer. So I wound up creating animal models, studying humans, finding lactating women and comparing them to women that were breastfeeding to see, because we already knew that oxytocin was essential, and that the only thing it's essential for is milk ejection, helping the breast. It doesn't create the milk, but it delivers it to the baby. So a very famous English biologist, Roger Short, said, prolactin sets the table and oxytocin serves the meal. And that's really about all we knew about lactation in 1980. There are some animal studies, but nobody was asking. As soon as I went to the library after I got the kids into preschool, had time to really dig, there wasn't anything there. It wouldn't have done me. It would have been of no value. So here I am. We feed forward now, and what I have discovered with the help of about 30,000 other people who have contributed in some way to this literature is that oxytocin is involved in everything, and especially everything that's affected by the vagus nerve. So, and we, neither Dr. Porges nor I had any idea that we were studying the same thing. I was studying social behavior. Oxytocin turned out to be very important to that. And of course, the vagus is playing a major role in our capacity to use safe social environments to restore, to heal, to be social.
And what do we have to know about oxytocin, the core of this molecule?
Well, first,
that people don't know.
A lot is not commonly known.
Mm-hmm.
I talk a lot to medical doctors. I've taught medical school several times as a faculty member at the University of Illinois. It's a very good question how to distill down what oxytocin does. I wrote a very long paper, which is online, called Is Oxytocin Nature's Medicine? The answer is yes. It's the chemical piece that ties us to our bodies, to other people, at the level of behavior. So it helps us to be able to engage in what could be very frightening and not to be afraid. It allows us to engage in fact, Steve coined this, immobility without fear. So immobility for a mammal can be very dangerous, holding still. Even holding still with a baby, you're at risk. But what surprised me, and remember, we're thinking of a 44-year journey, what surprised me was how many aspects of biology, from the cell to society to social behavior, were being impacted in a very powerful way by this molecule. It's not a small player. It's, in many cases, probably the most important chemical in the body of mammals. We're different from our reptilian ancestors because we have oxytocin. It allowed us to give birth. We have a real problem. Mammals have a real problem, and that's our brain. It gets in the way, it has to be covered with bone. We call that a skull. And even the baby babies' heads are too big. If you've ever seen a picture or a real cervix, you know that it's a very tiny opening. And my first son's head is impossible that he was born. It couldn't have happened. I look back and I think, this is crazy. Someone told me that. But that was known, not how it happens. We still don't understand birth. But what was known was all focused on this female reproduction piece of oxytocin's massive story. And because of that, people, I don't know exactly who, but they weren't women, decided it wasn't really important. It was just a kind of niche hormone with a very narrow band of functions. And that, as I've said, we can now say unequivocally that was completely wrong. So it not only does it regulate the vagus, which regulates everything, it regulates mitochondria, which give you energy. It regulates the microbiome, which we now know has a critical role in health, well-being. It regulates bone deposition, oxytocin does. It regulates muscle. Mice that are made genetically mutant for oxytocin don't have normal muscles. They have osteoporosis, in other words, weak bones. Their brains aren't working very well either. Every tissue.
And what can cause the lack or absence of oxytocin in humans, most of?
Yes, the very important question. Why do some people have? No one is absent oxytocin. There actually is no evidence of a human who doesn't have some oxytocin, who's alive. And there are no natural animal models where that molecule isn't present. So it's essential, and that's not normal. Actually, most of the molecules in the body, you can get rid of them, or they are naturally not occurring. That's not true for oxytocin. So oxytocin is essential, but the big question that you're asking, the one that no one has a full answer to, is what happens if oxytocin's very low? Not there in the amounts that the body needs to fully carry out the functions. And the answer so far has been, somewhat to my surprise, frankly, that social behavior is abnormal if you don't have adequate amounts of oxytocin. The body ages more quickly. The immune system is not working properly because oxytocin's actually part of a healthy immune system. The lowest levels of oxytocin that we've been able to measure were in people with post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorders. And it was about half the normal level in the studies. In fact, we published that study in 2024. It's open access. It basically, if you look up Carter and post-traumatic stress, you'll find this article on the internet. And what's exciting about this is, first, we kind of suspected that this would be the case, but I had never seen a whole group of people who had such low levels. What you see if you do assays of blood or saliva, for example, in humans, you see a wide range of oxytocin, but it's rare that it's really low, except in people who have PTSD, and now we're just seeing other disorders that have abnormal or atypical sociality. It's not always low in people with problems, and I think it's because the body tries to compensate. And in fact, it can be quite high when your body is under acute stress. So PTSD is a chronic disorder. But acute stress has a whole different biology. And healthy people respond to exercise, birth, sexual behavior, all kinds of stressful events with increases in oxytocin that are there, I believe, to be adaptive, to get the rest of our body prepared to help us have enough calcium to make healthy bones after a baby's born, for example, to feed the baby, to carry, to support the immune system. So it's rather miraculous, actually.
And does it make sense to supplement or with oxytocin, like artificial oxytocin, or is it nonsense?
Well, the article I wrote, it's called Pharmacological Reviews, asks that question. And that article's 2020. Up to that point, I've reviewed the studies where people tried to give more. I would say that in the short term, it can have benefits, but a very short term. In the long term, it depends on the person and the context. It's complicated because oxytocin doesn't work alone. It works as part of a system. And that system includes another ancient hormone, very similar to oxytocin, but with almost diametrically opposite effects. It's called vasopressin. It's part of the stress axis. So oxytocin can come in and override stress responses. But when you try to give it as a drug, so far, it has not been very successful. People have tried to use it in autism, where for some individuals you get transient improvement. There's a big study, a big review of the exogenous, we call it the outside oxytocin studies, arguing that maybe none of them have been done well enough to be sure one way or the other. The big problem is that nature compensates. So if I give someone a very large amount of oxytocin, their system, more than the system can tolerate, what will happen is the receptor for oxytocin will downregulate. If you keep giving it, your body says, well, obviously I've got plenty, I'll just turn down the receiver.
So it's better to find intervention that,
Exactly.
that helps us create
it's essential.
Natural oxytocin.
It's essential.
We usually say that oxytocin is produced when we hug someone but what do you think about that?
Well, I think a hug, that kind of discussion got started on the internet about 20 years ago by an economist who wasn't very sophisticated. And the problem with it is that if you walk up to someone and hug them, you better be prepared for what could happen next. And that may not be what you're looking for. If it's in a safe context, physical contact is one way, but by itself, it's not the most powerful way to release oxytocin. We are in search of the best answers. Babies are very good. If you've got a baby, access to a fairly young child, they are really excellent ways to get oxytocin to be released in both men and women. This is not a woman-only hormone. I should have mentioned that. It's very abundant, and most males have levels pretty close to the same as women. But the receptors are different, and also males and females are working with a different background chemistry. So vasopressin, this hormone that I've said is part of the stress response, is androgen dependent. Males have more of it under stress. It's a hormone that's dangerous, and oxytocin kind of fights with it to try to be adaptive. But it's really the most adaptive, quick way to release oxytocin is exercise, intense exercise. But that's only going to give you an acute release. So, in other words, you can't maybe stay at what they call VO2 max, a high level, for a long time. So we are looking for the answer to this question. My personal opinion, based on the little bit we know right now, is that stimulating the vagus in a healthy way is one of the best things you could do. But the vagus, like these two molecules, extremely adaptive. So you can't, in a sense, you can't fool Mother Nature. What you have to do is see things in context, and in the context not just of a safe or fearful environment, a threatening environment, but also in the context of time. And most research, we have very little money for this kind of work. Most research is done on a one-shot basis. Let's study it today. But the truth is, what oxytocin's best at is maintaining chronic good health. It's quite good also at creating pulses for lactation and birth. But its real talent is to allow our bodies to adaptively respond to stress. So stress will release oxytocin. That's why if you look on the internet, for the most part, what you find is not helpful. I can recommend these very detailed scientific papers I've written, and they are open access. But the short answer is try to maintain a safe environment. Use any kinds of tricks that the body accepts. What you can't do is fool it with drugs or alcohol. Both of those will give you transient increases, but they can't be maintained. For example, very popular right now is ecstasy or MDMA. Well, that gives you a beautiful increase in oxytocin that lasts a couple of hours, but it depletes the body's oxytocin, so the people describe a sort of hangover after that drug. And if they try to fix it with more MDMA, it's just like alcohol, what you have then is damage to the body. So a little bit of almost anything that's very powerful can actually release oxytocin. But we're not interested in just something that lasts a few hours. Most of us want long-term benefits. And that's where we're forced to study physiology. We're forced to understand the autonomic nervous system. Dr. Porges has designed an amazing kind of musical intervention, a sound intervention that mimics the body's own signals to allow us to get what I think is pretty close to a pure oxytocin signal. And we're in the process now of testing that. We have to. It's one thing for me to say that. It's another for it to be shown to be correct. But that's where we're going.
So there is a lot to discover,
Yeah.
You've discovered a lot, and there's still a lot to discover and to understand, and to help us be healthier and safer human beings, and maybe more connected human beings too.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Sue Carter.
Thank you.
Is there a last word you want to say, or to the people who are listening to us, something that is so important for you as a person?
Really critical to understand that we are biological, not to blame ourselves for how we feel. I think the biggest message is that if we respect and over time begin to understand how the body accomplishes good health, we can improve on it. We can't obsess over it to make ourselves well. For example, I'm not convinced that most of the things that are being advocated, special diets, special this or that, most of them are not as powerful as the things the body can do for itself if it feels safe. Okay.
Thank you very, very much.
My pleasure.
It's been really a pleasure to be with you.
Florence.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.